Thank you, everyone. Welcome to this discussion. We've got 6 great panelists. Looking forward to having a discussion on the 3 policies that will make green COVID recovery, economic recovery, much more likely. So just to give you some background, I'm Nick Tyrone. I'm the research director of Project Cygnus. Project Cygnus is dedicated to finding solutions that basically the idea is to make the economic recovery from the COVID crisis, as green and sustainable as possible, and also as local as possible. So that's the local angle. We're part of a team of all sorts of organizations that are working towards making Project Cygnus happen. And again, today's event is around what 3 policies will make for a green and local recovery from the COVID crisis. So again, I'm going to hand over as quickly as possible to the panel so that we can get going. Just a couple notes. Can I have everyone who isn't speaking just mute themselves? I'm less picky on the panelists, but certainly everybody who is not a panelist, if you can mute yourself. But also just everyone, just so we just get as little feedback, sound problems as possible. So I'm going to start. Our first speaker is Max Wakefield. He's the director of campaigns at Possible, and looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Max.
Thanks, Nick. I'm going to assume that everyone can hear me okay unless I see things flashing up in the chat. So I will crack on. For those of you that don't know, Possible is a relatively small climate charity, although we are growing. Based in Camden, but with campaigners and staff based around the country, and we specialise in public participation in practical solutions to climate change. So the shortest version of that is we don't do no campaigns. And I think it's worth caveating what I'm about to say by saying that I'm not really a policy person. I'm much more of a campaigner and a practitioner. And these 3 ideas are not the result of a comprehensive survey of every policy in the landscape. And I'm not necessarily saying these are the 3 things we do at the expense of everything else, but they are 3 things that I think would be really interesting to explore. So first off, we know that we're going to have to spend some money in order to get the economy going again, whenever we are able to come out the other side of this coronavirus crisis. And so we're going to need some big projects. And currently one of the big projects out there that we're expecting to sink money into is RIS2, basically building new roads. There's a £27.5 billion budget for new roads. And I think it's fair to say this is total madness with respect to climate. We shouldn't be building new roads at a time where we need to be cutting emissions. And really, the plans are based on some pretty outdated looking growth forecasts, not to mention the fact that we have the phenomenon of induced demand. If you build more roads, more people drive on them. So instead of investing in new dirty roads, why not use that money to invest in making our current roads actually part of the climate solution? So we're about to work in partnership for an electric maze trial in 2021 to demonstrate the potential of directly powering electric trucks and passenger coaches via overhead electrical lines, AC lines, on the slow lane of the motorways. So basically imagine an electrified train with the wires running above it, but just picture that on the slow lane of the motorway, with lorries and coaches fitted with, they're called pantographs, the things that pop up and draw current from the wires. It is a proven technology. It's not particularly extensively used because it's relatively new in its application, but the principles are very similar to what you would find on the rail network. And of course, we know how to do that. It would be capital intensive. We could spend 20 of that £27.5 billion kitting out the key freight routes in the country. With this new technology, it would be innovative, it would require high skills jobs, and it would importantly provide a new consumer offer to reduce car use for intercity travel without putting extra strain on the rail network. And the great thing is that we also have the technology and the know-how to plug in local community-owned renewable generators, solar farms, onshore wind turbines, to power that network. And so by using the electric motorways actually contribute to local economic development. The second thing is looking at cities and ending car dominance in them. We know transport is the largest source of emissions, and cars are the largest single chunk of that. We also know EVs can't do the job of decarbonising without reduction in miles driven. And the air pollution was already a health crisis before COVID came along, and it's now simply combined with it, and it leading to an estimated 15% higher deaths than we would have had if we had clean air. Despite that, 7 times more people will die in 2020 due to toxic air than COVID worldwide. And this, of course, has a huge economic cost. We also have highly valuable public space in our cities, lying more or less redundant under stored cars. But 4 times the size of Richmond Park in London is sitting underneath cars that no one's using. And there are neighbourhoods all across the country with no access to trees or green space, in which about 500,000 people live. And you're much more likely to live in one of those areas if you're from an ethnic minority. So policies to decisively over the next 10 years end car dominance in cities through a mix of carrot and stick, but also innovation and new service models will have multiple wins in terms of climate, in terms of public health, both physical and mental, and in terms of the provision of public amenities. And all of this will save us a huge amount of money and make our lives much nicer to live. And finally, this is a big one, basically invite everyone. The transition and the recovery from COVID cannot just be something that is based on the old ways of doing things, which haven't decisively dealt with inequality in this country. And we're going to have lots of people out of work, and this winter is going to be very hard, and the economy will be suffering for a long time yet. And yet, lots of trees need planting, lots of hedges need planting, we need peat bogs restoring, we need natural flood defensive building, we need homes insulating. So why not create a national climate service, somewhat in the style of Roosevelt's New Dealers, open to school leavers and anyone put out of work by COVID, offering training and paid employment across the country through a network of local councils, civic organisations and businesses, with the priorities about what needs doing set locally. Conservation groups are already proposing something along these lines in the form of a civilian conservation corps, and this proposal would expand that to include training and opportunities across the whole green economy. Of course, this would provide jobs and skills. That would be its primary purpose, as well as actually delivering much needed projects to improve our countryside and cut our emissions. But I think also it would create a sense of participation in something bigger. And that would be really important in the run up to the UK hosting COP in a year's time. So that's my 3.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Max. Much appreciated. That was very interesting. So I'm going to hand right over to Ted Christie-Miller. He's a researcher at Onward, which is a leading centre-right think tank. He was the co-author of a paper, I think it was last year, called Costing the Earth. So about how we solve the climate crisis. So I'll hand over to Ted.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I think I must have slightly misread the brief because I wrote 5 policies, but you'll be glad I've shed 2 of them in the last 5 minutes, so I'll have a shorter spin for you. So just those of you that don't know much about Onward, we were formed in May 2020, and our focus is new ideas for the next generation. So focusing on lots of different issues, but obviously climate is a huge one. And I think actually looking at more a sort of broader global approach, if you look at it at the moment with what we've seen in South Korea and Japan and China with the net zero targets coming in, and potentially, depending on what happens across the Atlantic on Tuesday, it's potentially a very exciting time for us climate geeks. Potentially it will be, politics of climate change could really dominate for the next decade and well, century, I suppose. But anyway, getting into the policies we should be prioritising. Firstly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at sort of energy efficiency, then actually looking at nature-based solutions, and then on sort of green infrastructure financing, sort of the 3 areas I want to look at. Firstly, on energy efficiency, in my eyes, this is a really easy win for the government to be done, and with really tangible change. And unlike a lot of energy policy, the Green Homes Grant, I think that needs to be expanded really and opened up to traditional energy companies that are currently assigned to eco but can't actually use the Green Homes Grant. So that really needs to be ramped up, and perhaps on the level of funding that the CCC have recommended, which is sort of upwards of I think 30 billion a year. So that needs to be done. And then also looking at VAT. So in the report that Nick mentioned, we talked about decarbonising heat, and how at the moment you've got electricity and gas at 5% each. What we really need to do is ramp up the gas VAT to 20%, plummet the electricity VAT down to zero, while taking off the different climate levies on it, to really try and rebalance the scale and incentivize electrification, so electric heat pumps and the like, which could really make a difference. So that's on energy efficiency. And then actually going on to nature-based solutions, probably I'll reiterate some of what Max said. I think we both first met actually on a call of energy and environment policy people, talking about the National Nature Service and the potential for that to really be a big part of the recovery. So obviously we've got a lot of young people that are going to be unemployed over the next few months, coinciding with a real need to rebuild our tree cover and our ecosystems more generally. So I think there's definitely potential in that. And then also, I actually read a piece for Business Green this morning, setting out the case for carbon offsetting to really be a powerful force for nature restoration, and a market-led one when we need the scale of change that we need. And then in the Conservative Manifesto, I think it was 900 million trees by 2050 was roughly what they were sort of aiming for. And in order to do that, as I would say, this is from a centralized think tank, but you need the market to drive that, because that is the only thing that will do it at the scale we need. There's been plenty of NGOs and important organizations over the years that have tried to ramp up our afforestation rates, but actually I think if you have a sort of a market-based mechanism that can drive that, I think it could be really powerful, and regulation would be a key part of that. So whether that would be Office for carbon removal or whatever, or perhaps a carbon exchange in London, that would be really effective in nature restoration. And then just going forward, sort of looking at sort of infrastructure really, and the financing of it, green infrastructure. About a month ago, I wrote a report with Gareth Davies MP, who used to be a ESG fund manager, and we recommended that the government create a British Development Bank, which would help drive private sector capital into infrastructure, and in specifically green infrastructure as well. And the benefit of this, we modelled it on KfW in Germany, which in some years has funded up to 90% of wind investment in Germany, is they have a mobilisation rate that is really quite high. So we've, even in the different infrastructure banks we've had or investment banks we've had in the UK, so we've got the Green Infrastructure Bank, had a mobilisation rate of 3.4. So that's for every pound that is put in, £3.40 of private sector capital is crowded in. And this sort of taps into the wider infrastructure gap that we have of about 8 billion a year in the UK, and the potential for both green, like the green bonds, and potentially regional bonds to both sort of drive the government's levelling up agenda and the net zero agenda could be huge. If you look at, actually, the KfW was used to close the gap of East and West Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and it reduced the gap of disposable incomes by about 50%. And this is the sort of challenge that the government needs to do, needs to hammer home with the levelling up agenda. And actually, the green aspect of this and green infrastructure should be a huge part of that. I mean, there might be other people that would propose specifically a green investment bank, which I wouldn't be opposed to in principle. It's sort of the same idea, but actually I think a wider spanning development bank would be more impactful. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Ted. That's great. I'm going to go right over to our third speaker. Her name is Lean Doody. She is the Integrated Cities and Planning Leader Europe at ERUP, who are also one of our partners on Project Cygnus. Very happy to have her along. Lean, I'll hand over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So I'm going to start by talking about the sort of shift in economic geography that we're seeing at the moment, in terms of the massive shift to working from home, which lots of us are manifesting, I think, probably on this call still, and the sort of implications and the opportunities that opens up. But first, we've seen a number of surveys coming out in the last few months around people's appetite for working from home, how many people are working from home. And clearly it's not everyone, but it's a significant part of the population, and a massive increase in the numbers of people working from home from normally. And I guess the big question is, will it stick? And I think that what we're seeing is a number of surveys, including a survey that we did ourselves with a developer client called iPut, which are showing that people, say around 40%, and it is quite stable, of those working from home are currently keen to continue working from home in some shape or form. So they don't want to work from home all the time. The figure is normally 2 to 3 days a week. But they don't want to go back to the office full time. And I think our survey and many other surveys are showing that the numbers who want to go back to a 5-day-a-week commuting existence is around 1 in 10. So that points to, I mean, clearly we don't, you know, it's difficult to predict the future at the best of times. And I think at the moment it's particularly difficult. But I think that shows to a degree of stickiness that we will see in terms of, you know, once we get through this period, which could last, you know, another 6 months, a year, perhaps longer, people's habits will have shifted and changed sufficiently to say that we are looking at quite a different economic geography from before, in terms of the importance of the CBD and the newer importance of more local economic hubs and local kind of towns and centres. And I think the impacts of that will play out in a number of areas. Obviously, transport is one area. There is clearly an opportunity to reduce carbon emissions through reduced commuting, but that will play out in a beneficial way only if people have options, other transport, maybe more active transport options nearer to home, and also that the land use nearer to home serves their needs. So you will hear lots of talk about 15-minute city and concepts like that, where, you know, the land use, the things that people need are within a kind of 15-minute journey from their homes, a 15-minute walking or cycling journey, not a 15-minute car journey. So I think that there is quite a lot of work to do on the part of government and other stakeholders to, first of all, look at the placemaking opportunities in these kind of residential areas. So in terms of placemaking, thinking about the land use, thinking about making attractive places to live, thinking about active travel, more cycling infrastructure, more walking infrastructure. And we are again starting to see that play out in a number of cities around the world, Milan it being one kind of quite prominent example where they're kind of repurposing a lot of their car parking spaces into more active travel spaces. Seeing that in Dublin, where I'm based, for more active travel. I think then the other big opportunity, so I think in terms of policies, I think there is a need to look at the working from home trend quite carefully, understand it, understand the implications, think about more active travel policies, think about the impact on economic geography and more active placemaking policies. And I think then thirdly, energy efficiency is probably the other area. And again, I think working from home is going to be an interesting trigger potentially towards more renovation at scale. Where I am at the moment, there is a target to have 500,000 building retrofits by 2030, and that's out of a total housing stock of about 1.7 million. And one of the, you know, we look at sort of trigger points in terms of, you know, people moving house or, you know, a new baby or selling a home. Those are often trigger points for renovation. I wonder, and this is slightly speculative, I wonder whether a cold winter spent working at home will also be a trigger point for renovation and retrofit. And then if that is the case, the challenge then is to have the supports in place and the supply chain in place to actually be able to deal with that. And that's one of the things that the European renovation wave renovation strategy paper is in response to the Irish retrofit paper has just been issued for consultation. So an awful lot going on in that space. I'm sure we can pick it up in the questions if needs be. Thanks very much.
Wonderful. Excellent. Great. Thank you very much for that. I will go right to my next speaker, who is Lord Porter, CBE, who is the leader of South Holland District Council in Lincolnshire, and also a former chairman of the Local Government Association. So very interested to hear what Gary has to say, particularly on the local stuff. So Gary, over to you.
You're on mute. Somebody had to be the first. Yeah, I'm sure most of the panel will probably have better credentials to be on the panel rather than myself. If I'm brutally honest, I'm probably a green agenda schizophrenic. I can see lots of positives and lots of kind of opportunities, but I can see lots of skeletons to the past of the green agenda that still hang about, that will keep some people away from it. Personally thinking about low scale onshore wind turbines. If I drive from where I live in Lincolnshire across the north, the scale wind turbines that have fallen over, broken, don't work. So I think reliable to see that the bit that they can play from home is going to work. And I don't think a massive national project will be the one that does it. I think it will be millions and millions of small scale things that make the difference, if I'm being brutally honest. And I kind of got greener myself at the start of lockdown and more optimistic when I could see more people kind of growing their own food and all the rest of it. There was some sense of hope at that stage. And now what I've learned from 6 months of having my council staff being split up into the manual workers turning up and the office workers being able to work from home, I've got a blue collar, white collar fight going on. And that's been added to by a younger and older member of staff conflict, where those of us old enough and built up enough capital behind us, enough space in a house to say working from home could be a pleasure. But those younger are working from a bedroom or from a dining room table. Is something that we should all factor in, and something that addresses that imbalance between people of an age and people of a working style needs to be adjusted. One of the things that makes me laugh about the civil service not coming to London anymore is they don't seem to have realised that their wages are based on going to London, and that if they are working from home, at some point somebody's going to realise home could be anywhere, particularly in England, which will be quite useful for the levelling up agenda, given that whole scale departmental move could be a possibility. So that may well be able to play into the green agenda by reducing the amount of travel that's necessary. Of course, the trouble with that is the less commuting people do, the less scope for investment there'll be in commuting styles. So, you know, we want to put everybody on a train. Well, if nobody's going to London at that scale, who's going to pay for the trains? So you've kind of got those issues to deal with. Nobody's mentioned kind of different stuff for me. I think the Brexit thing's been avoided so far, which is good, but you've kind of got the food agenda and Brexit bumping into each other. Are we all going to start eating only things produced on an island? That will play into an opportunity for some and a threat to a lot of other people's businesses. Nuclear, well, did the government take the right line by having a moratorium on the nuclear industry? Is that an area where we do need to start investing again? Given that we're importing a lot of electricity from France, and France is a major generator from nuclear. I'm not sure whether we can have our cake and eat it on that one. Hydrogen technology, but then you need a lot of space for storage. I wouldn't fancy living in a city that's got lots of hydrogen storage in it, just in case that went wrong. So I don't have any messages of hope.
Oh my God.
Other than you have to give hope to everybody. You can't just have the hope in the very last where it seems to be. People have to have skin in the game going forward. We have to make sure that whatever we do, it's going to be inclusive, where everybody says it's part of their future, not just the future of those other people. So there's my note of depression in this happy band of the world could be wonderful.
Thank you very much, Gary. Appreciate that. We'll come back to those thoughts. And I'll move on to Richard McWilliams, who is Director of Sustainability at Turner & Townsend. Richard, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. I'm just sharing the screen there, hopefully so that you can see it. Just as a couple of slides. Tell me if you can still see that. Thumbs up, hopefully. Don't really need to see it, but I'm just aware you're having an awful lot of information as a set of listeners, so I thought to try and just at least set mine out. My point, you know, TNT's very much a delivery oriented, where client sides support and advisors for the investment programs in real assets and across real estate, infrastructure, natural resources. So my view on policy is one of getting the policy pulled through to practice, and I think, you know, policy is there to address major challenges, and in my view is to deliver a self-funding pathway to that, our net zero or low carbon future. And I think these policies need to clearly deliver outcomes, and some of the ones I think are low hanging fruit are the ones that are closest to that tipping point of creating that change in the market that catalyzes the achievement of outcomes. Because I think a lot of the conversation we're having is very, very big picture, and that's not my area of comfort. I got a load of I'm running 2 retrofit accelerator programs for the Mayor of London at the minute for homes and workplaces, and I've got problems. We could really do a lot, and I just really want your help to support some policies to address that. Maybe, you know, one of the problems here is we talked about energy efficiency. That's what I'm going to be talking about, but I'm going to unpack it into 3 policies. We have some major challenges achieving the level of energy efficiency. The demand reduction, you can have you can't have an unlimited supply of renewable energy, really. The grid won't take it. So you need to reduce demand. And with the built environment being 40 or even over 50%, depending who you ask, of the actual problem, the problem is we don't have a fundable roadmap of a solution, either at the volume of funding available or the scale of skills base required. And government, even with the 6.8 billion it's investing or committed to investing so far, can't single-handedly deliver that net zero future, but it can create the market opportunities to create a self-funding, self-perpetuating market that just works. And so for me, actually, what we need to consider in policy terms is some key concepts that are going to drive that self-funding pathway to net zero. And it should really be one that engages and works for everybody, especially consumers. You know, this is actually about consumers, it's about investors and institutional investors, and it's actually about the market and suppliers. Because if we can get desirable solutions for energy efficiency in homes and in properties that actually just work, there's simple solutions that just work, and anybody that knows the space means there's a dramatic underperformance of the sector currently. But if we could get it just working and in a guaranteed way, then actually that will attract a shed load of institutional investment to scale up and roll out the market and unlock a potentially new 400, 500, 600 billion pound market in the UK alone. And if we get that going, then we're going to close the loop and say the market's going to invest to pursue it, and all of a sudden it's going to be a bit more like an iPhone or a new car or these high value consumer goods that we want to buy. Imagine, you know, imagine if your user experience for heating your home was similar to buying an iPhone bundle. They upgraded your home just for continuing the contract, because the way they did it would self-fund the capital upgrades. That's the kind of solution we're talking about here. And that's the opportunity, and we're actually delivering those on the ground at this moment in time, but we need help to make the market work. So 3 policies, 3 policies for me that will help accelerate our green recovery. First of all is don't have dysfunctional intermediate targets, which are a different pathway that don't get you to net zero. In that sense, energy performance certificates for homes and properties targeting C by 2030 is a strategic misstep. It's going to take you in the wrong direction. It's going to deliver works into those properties which need to be ripped out and replaced to get to zero. So let's don't do that. Let's focus on solutions that get to net zero. Now, the current solutions are too expensive. So what we need to do is drive a market that gets the scale and gets the investment to actually get those products at the price and performance point we need. So please, government, don't spend £6.8 billion subsidising an old-fashioned, traditional, dysfunctional market. Use it to prime, promote and support the development of a future self-funding industrialised market for retrofit. Currently, they've put 50 million into that. How about the full next year's 3.8 billion into creating that market? It's a 600 billion pound market. They could spend that, create it and walk away, and they've got a whole pathway. And my final point is actually, this isn't just about real estate. I did a report launched earlier this summer with the Green Finance Institute. The existing infrastructure assets are a key blind spot in our pathways to net zero. And one of the key policy dysfunctions is around, actually in regulation, is around 5-year asset management cycles, because quite a lot of investment will not get done on a 5-year investment cycle. Some of them aren't even asking for it. So as a policy request, I'd say, actually, let's promote strategic and investment road mapping for multi-AMP periods to allow all those utility and regulated industries to do long-term investment to get their part of this problem towards zero. So the 3 things is long-term targets, not intermediate dysfunctional targets. Using government spending to drive future markets, not support current parasitic markets that don't perform. And the 3rd thing is look at our asset management planning and regulated company regulations to help them to drive a multi-decade investment roadmap. They're all practical and will deliver outcomes, and they will unlock major opportunities for jobs, growth, and investment. So I'd really ask you to support any way you can the achievement of those policy changes. And that's me for now.
Great, thank you very much, Richard. Great, perfect, thanks. Right, so we've got one speaker left, and then we're going to go to, if I can ask the non-participants, the crowd, if you've got any questions, think of them now, and if you could put them in the chat, that would be wonderful, so that when our speakers, we've come to the end of our speaker introductions, that there might be some questions that I can throw to the panel. So, without further ado, I shall go to my final speaker, who is Gabriel Darcy. He's the Senior Vice President at Brexit Partners. And Gabriel, thank you very much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Nick, and good morning, everybody. Gary, you mentioned about Brexit not being mentioned, but Brexit Partners is part of my current title. Actually, I've spent most of my time in industry, in the food industry, and in the energy infrastructure industry. A lot of the points that you have made, all of the panelists have made so far, are well-made points, and I think that they all speak to a lesser or greater extent, a shift and the need to shift to the economic goalposts in favor of more sustainable green policies that are sustainable, and this was alluded to by a number of the speakers. It's sustainable not just from an environmental and a green perspective, but from an economic and a social perspective as well. It's kind of going back to the future a little bit. I advocated this and introduced this concept in my board Lamona days, large state-owned enterprise here when I was managing director, and introduced the triple bottom line concept. And I think that it's a good way to look at what we need to do. Fundamentally, what we need to do is we need to approach this in a triple bottom line method that supports sustainable job creation, clearly, and we need that badly, but also supports innovation, because there's a huge amount of innovation going on at present that actually is removing a lot of the prior obstacles that used to be there. And in fact, there's behavioral innovation taking place, as Leon was alluding to earlier on. We need to look at making it easy. I use the term, making it easy for our people, our population, to be sustainable. Like, it's very complex. Even if you're well motivated, as a family, as a worker, it's very hard to be, in inverted commas, sustainable. There are more obstacles than enablers in that pathway. So I see a huge opportunity. I see the climate emergency is a bit like the COVID emergency. It's a little bit going at a slower pace, we believe, but the response is what's needed. And it's a response akin to our current response to COVID. So we have learned a lot in the last 6 months. You know, over 80% of the global workforce have been directly affected by full or partial lockdowns. I think that's phenomenal. It's never happened in our time before. We've learned and accepted to work remotely, greatly assisted by technology, such as what we're deploying at the moment for this conference. And we've seen how government can intervene very dramatically, very decisively, and might I say, with a fair degree of acceptance, might be through gritted teeth, but acceptance and support once the facts and the information were made available and properly communicated. So I think some of these behaviors and actions would have been unthinkable only at the start of this year. You know, I think, again, it was alluded to earlier, it's estimated that 1/3 of the global workforce will sustain remote working practices on a permanent basis. Like, that's a huge change in attitude, a huge change in perspective. I go on to the major policy areas. Look, it's wide and it's deep. Policy across everything from transport, health, the environment. It's wide and a deep area. But where would be the quickest wins, as far as I can see, and cognizant of the current situation as it pertains to the population that we have in Britain and indeed in Ireland. So, first thing, we need to break the link between economic growth and carbon emissions, and that's clear. It's been mentioned earlier on, I won't go into it in any further detail, but we need to accelerate and incentivize large-scale retrofitting of our housing stocks for energy efficiency, insulation, and indeed the adoption of new technology. I know, Gary, you might raise your hands to this, but actually that's what we need to do. Consumers are ready for it. They want it because, as was pointed out, they're looking forward to spending a long, cold winter stuck in their house. They've never spent as much time. They're now using it in a large extent as their home domain. Of course, they will embrace this. Of course, we have financing of this, but when I hear one of the area speakers talk about 28 or 29 billion being invested in to build new roads, I say, guys, what planet are we living on? We're totally out of sync on that one. But accelerate large-scale retrofitting. This tends to be locally based activity, so it's good for the local economy. It's very labor intensive. It will require education, investment, and we need to retrain and reskill the large numbers of people who are displaced out of hospitality, out of aviation, and other sectors that are not going to return anytime soon. And obviously there's large visible and immediate benefits for the occupiers. But one critical issue with regards to a policy of this nature, it needs to be simple. It needs to be accessible. It needs to be simplified regarding qualification, the oversight. We need to have good quality. It was mentioned about bad quality small-scale wind farms. I totally get that. Quality needs to be a focus and delivery, and it's something immediate that can be done almost immediately. Quickly moving to my second point, we need to rethink transport completely, especially public transport. Pre-COVID, we had reached the limit of our existing transport model, which was characterized by increasing congestion, longer commutes, and out-of-control emissions, and a transport system struggling to fill the gap between what I would term outdated work practices and any sort of a reasonable home and family life. So what we need to do, we need to look at our large-scale investment in the fleet electrification with all consequential issues, including retraining, reskilling, retooling, and so forth. We need to redesign based on the changed commuting patterns. Again, this has been alluded to earlier on. The game has changed substantially. and people's perceptions and people's outlooks have changed, and people's behaviours have changed, and we need to get our infrastructure and public transport reflecting that changed situation. We need a key focus on reducing car dependence, thereby reducing emissions and increasing the quality of life. And indeed, as was mentioned earlier, I do see a possibility of a renaissance of our rural towns and villages in this policy by better integrating rural transport and regional connectivity. Finally, and lastly, and I'll be very quick on this one, Nick, we need to develop a more sustainable and fair food policy. You know, the current proposal in the EU is for the next CAP, Common Agricultural Policy, between 23 and 27, that between 20 and 30% of direct farm payments are linked to green schemes, such as some of what has been mentioned, greater afforestation, reduced pesticide, fertilizer use, greater organic food production, and so forth. Now, look at whether this figure should be more or less is a debatable point. But the key point is that this is part of the recently announced EU Green Deal to make the EU carbon neutral by 2050. Of course, where Britain is concerned, Brexit enters the fray. And with due respect, I've been following the whole Brexit debate for the last 4 years. There's been little or no mention about the carbon issue and about carbon emissions in the whole discussions. It's all about the trade agreements, world trade, tariffs, and so forth. Currently, Britain is about 70% self-sufficient from a food perspective. It's always relied on Ireland, principally, to fill this gap. Ireland, with its moist and mild climate, is ideally suited for grass growth that then has given rise to the food that we produce. Britain is our largest destination market. The current Brexit discussions puts this trade at risk, and I think it would be a great mistake if this was replaced by Brazilian beef, New Zealand lamb, or butter from New Zealand from a purely carbon perspective. So I think the key policy issue should be on shortening supply chains, not elongating them, encouraging local production and consumption, and with a view to make Britain self-sufficient for its food needs over the next 20 years, 30 years. Thank you. I think I might have gone over my time.
Completely fine. Thank you very much. Thank you to all the speakers. That was wonderful. Thank you for all your reviews. We do have some questions from the crowd. I'm thinking about best. I'll start with one and see how we go. So a question from Ed Evans. He asked, how do you think the government might try to recover the money provided already to support the economy? So I'll broaden that question out to the panel. So basically, obviously, we've gone through a period where government spending has gone way up to correct for the COVID measures, principally lockdown. I guess it's really, what's the future of government spending? And I suppose, looking at it from a slightly negative point of view, are we worried about the idea of, well, the government spent a lot of money and will have to spend a lot of money. Will it de-emphasize the carbon agenda, based on the fact that, will we run out of money? So basically, just government spending COVID as well, because I'd be very interested to hear what their thoughts on that as well. So anyone want to jump in from the panel? Anybody? any statements on government spending?
Nick,
Yeah, Ted, go on.
Yeah, I mean, the obvious option is I suppose carbon taxes. I'm sure some of you have looked at the Zero Carbon Campaign's excellent work that's been coming out. Well, they've been doing a year now, but they've done a sort of end of year report, which looks at sort of sector by sector carbon pricing. And I think it's definitely an option the government should look at. Obviously, this is reported sort of tensions between the Treasury and Number 10, whether what they want to do with that. But obviously, the EU ETS has just failed. Sort of historically failed, and I think actually having carbon taxes at a time now and bring them in would raise really crucial revenue for green projects, but more just generally for the taxpayers' coffers. So I think that would be really important, and that could be joined with a net zero fiscal rule that that as a looking at it from a sort of sensible centre-right perspective, actually having a net zero target with no net zero fiscal rule is actually a very sort of unconservative thing to do. And I think we actually recommended in a previous report that we should have a net zero fiscal rule, which would ask the OBR and the Climate Change Committee to jointly report on environmental progress. And I think that's something that should be implemented, just to have sustainable accounting of how much we're spending on this. So yeah, I think those sort of two things coming in together would be an addition that would help deal with the lack of funding post-COVID.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you for that. I've got another question from the crowd. One is around what do panel members think about ensuring the current generation of pupils leave school with the skills and desire to contribute to carbon zero goals. So basically, what are we doing now to ensure that people have the skills, etc., to look towards a sort of creating a net zero future? Anyone, any of the panel, can come in on that?
Hi, it's Richard McWilliams. Hi, if I just kick off, and I think there's a couple of things here. I think, first of all, there is quite a lot of policy or initiatives in place in schools around eco-schools. I think they've waned recently, but there is curriculum opportunities. Lots of teachers would say it's a compressed schedule with a national curriculum, so it's more a case of trying to how to design it into national curriculum as topics rather than additional workload. The other facet I think you're talking about is pulling through into training the next generation of people with the skills. And there are a lot of apprenticeships. The whole Social Value Act here has an absolute slam dunk opportunity to begin to train up apprenticeships for this. Some analysis for retrofit for domestic housing alone says it's 300,000 new skilled labourers needed to do the work. I think it's most probably more than that. So there is apprenticeship opportunities to do that, and there are increasingly qualifications like the retrofit coordinator and that kind of thing that people can pull through to do. But it does need a skilled workforce. It also needs citizens. It also needs citizens that are aware. And what we're seeing at the minute is actually we support a lot of schools delivering energy efficiency, and actually they get a lot of active support from their peers. Not as bleak as initially sound, I think.
Right. While I have you, Richard, someone's pointed something directly at you. It was about your point on 5-year investment cycles for regulated infrastructure, and the specific question is around what kind of structures and mechanisms do you think are needed to support analysis for anticipatory investments in this regard? Is there anything you could point to?
Well, there's a load of bits. So let me give you an answer. I'm not sure it's the one you want.
I tried to distill it as much as
I saw the note, and I was so in terms of anticipatory investments in the energy sector, I think you're going to have future policy issues like heat pumps versus hydrogen. But let's bring it down to a practical level. In the water sector, there is 46% of the market has not implemented advanced anaerobic digestion, which means that 46% of the market is booting out methane, which is 297 times the CO2 effect on climate warming. We could just do, and some of the reason we're not doing it is they haven't got a push. Some of it is it takes longer than 5 years to pay back. If we could have multi-AMP settlements, because these custodians of our infrastructure aren't going away, if we could just say to them, carve out, and there is policy conversations going on, carve out certain times of asset intervention and say, if that's a 15 to 20 year payback, carve it out, remove it from the regulated asset base, fund it separately, and then you're not double bubbling it on future asset management. The settlements. The other version is also to use new models of, well, not new, but re-emphasize and promote forms of finance, such as direct procurement for customers. Now, there's water companies are doing this at the minute where they can carve out a specific system. And I was speaking to Welsh Water, who's doing something like this at the minute, £300 million investment to rationalise some water treatment works. And that can be carved out and separated out from the normal asset management planning cycle. And it should be, and then that can target net zero as well. But it's just a whole swathe of it that's needed. And there are dysfunctional policy contentions in and amongst the mix here. So it's a complicated space, but we just need to review the regulatory cycle and how it funds net zero. The last water settlement didn't even mention net zero. It didn't even mention, settled January this year, didn't even mention net zero in the settlement. How good is that?
Good.
Anyway,
No, great. Thank you for that. So we've got another question, which is around policy proposals at national level, and then looking at how they can be distilled at local level. So really, this is a question. It's about housing, so it's about retrofitting, but I guess it could be broadened. It could be broad, which is, I guess it comes. Do we make this more local? I mean, Gary had said, you know, it's probably going to come down to a million little things. I guess here's a question: What can the national government, what can the Westminster government do to help support the local communities as much as possible? And that could be, you know, standing out of the way at some points. But how does it use incentives or regulation? How does it help local?
But surely, Nick, that is the way.
Yeah.
The single biggest thing central government can do is stand to one side. We've seen on just about everything that wipes its face, unless it's a war, we don't need national government to pull that together, do we? Look at some of the responses to COVID and how backward they've been because they've been driven from the centre.
Right.
COVID response would have been much better built up on a load of local responses and aggregated up to the government. The data would have been better collected at a local level than aggregated up to central government, not sent to central government and then eventually disaggregated and sent back down to local government to react to. Even now on COVID figures, I'm getting them 3 or 4 days in arrears. It's too late to ask me to do something because the things happened and moved on. And it's going to be the same with this agenda. You need a government that paints a big picture and does its bit and then stands to one side. So taxation for it should be done on a local level, not on a national level. And it shouldn't be regressive. If you're going to get more people to buy into the agenda, you can't punish people to the same pound note sign regardless of what their income is. And that's the trouble with taxes on, you know, petrol taxes and gas taxes and all the rest of it. They hit poor people as much as they hit rich people. And that's not the way you're going to get people to buy into it. If somebody's struggling to put a dinner on their table and you tell them they're going to have to do one dinner or less a week because you're taxing them because somebody else wants to feel good when they go to sleep at night about the green agenda, people off. Somehow you are paying.
Right.
And that won't be through a taxation system that penalises people at the same level. You can't keep hitting regressive taxes on Joe Public because they won't buy into the agenda.
Well, one of the things I'm hearing, Gary, and you can tell me because you're a council leader, so you're well placed to respond to this, which is people at local level saying, well, I'd love to do X, Y, and Z, but actually one of the problems is particularly England is incredibly centralised. And how do we do it unless there are major changes in terms of the devolution settlement, whatever that is, in terms of giving local councils more powers?
Yeah, so even on those of us who still have council houses, there is about 100 of us who still got our council housing stock. We don't determine our rents. Central government tells me how much the rent's got to be. Where is the sense to that? Why am I not allowed to say to somebody, if I put some things onto your house that makes the electric bill cheaper and the gas bill cheaper, I need to put your rent up by £2 a week to pay for it, but it saves you a tenner a week on your energy bill. Why can't I do that? Why does it need central government to tell me 36 Acacia Avenue has to be £72 a week for its rent? Why can't I make it £74 a week and tell them they're saving a tenner on their lecky bill and a tenner on their gas bill?
Yeah.
I'm not allowed to put cost reflective rent increases on, even though I can make people's lives better because a warm home is better than a cold, damp home, and I can save their money on their gas and electric bill by doing it.
Right. Yeah.
So,
right.
Gary,
more government bad.
Gary, just on that point, there are some alternative ways to address that split incentive that you're talking about. You know, the asset investor has to have the cost benefit. Something called Energiesprong, which is the Dutch word for energy leap, and that's a way of cycling, creating a comfort plan, that mobile phone bundle of warmth, heat, and power, as a charge the extent of the utility bill, backed off with the asset owner investing in upgrades that deliver a guaranteed net zero energy solution. So it's a way of reworking commercial, but outcome complex. Well, it's a servitized solution. An alternative might be simpler, is allowing you to set the rent to reflect the asset investment. I totally agree. And in terms of driving local jobs and the local agenda, an example for me from London Borough of Barking and Dagenham is a good one, where we've been supporting them retrofits and building retrofit and heat networks and green infrastructure. And what they're pulling together in all of this is actually an opportunity to use their land and their own latent demand for doing this, of a shared venture with a local factory, you know, almost setting up a factory then to serve their own market and using their land and their demand as the base flow for somebody to invest. Now, I think that's a repeatable model to drive local capacity to address this huge market opportunity, and it'd be one I would be interested to explore with others if there
are. We've come to the fun of the program, so we're going to be doing a poll for everyone to take part in. So we've got our first poll, and if you can get our first poll up and running, thank you very much. So this is what is the current, so this is a basic one, so attendees, everybody, just what is your current focus of work, and it's split into different categories. So I give everybody just a few seconds to sort of start filling that in. I'll give you guys 30 seconds to fill that in, and then we'll go forward. All right, okay. And while that's happening, I've got another question, a very interesting question from the crowd once we're done with the poll. Right, let's just see if the flow is, I think everybody who's going to vote has voted. So there we are, thank you very much. Right, okay, so that's interesting. So we've got a real mix of people from local and national government, city, regional planning, the private sector. So, and a lot of policy people. That's probably the biggest one. But that's kind of what I respect, and that's very interesting. Thank you very much. I'll share the results. There we are. Great. So thank you very much, guys. Right, the next question from the crowd is needed to support the suggested policies. So all the policies that we've talked about, and there's there's a reasonable amount of crossover in terms of what everybody's mentioned. Retrofitting's obviously been continually brought up, as transportation infrastructure. So the question is really about data. So what data do you think is missing or inaccessible to the decision makers? And that decision makers could be any, but that could be any level of government, or indeed even in the private sector. If the data exists but isn't being shared, etc., for competition reasons, how can we incentivize those who have the data that's required to share this data? So anybody have any ideas on that? Any thoughts from the panel? I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but yeah, just data.
I mean, I could say that. I mean, we're doing a whole project on that at the moment, so we will have work to share on that probably around the January timeframe. But I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, clearly, policymakers need to be, as we discussed earlier, we're in a period of change, but we don't know exactly how the change is going to shake out. And the initial indicators are that certainly in terms of how people work, that's and the economic geography around that, how people move around, the impacts on housing efficiency, that's all been discussed. So I think the work that we're doing at the moment is to look at, well, what are the indicators that policymakers need to understand to help them to monitor that change, so that they can, given that we don't exactly know, what are the different indicators that we use to try to track that. And it's going to be a whole range of things, but it could be, in terms of private sector data, it could be around spatially distributed spend data, at how people's spending patterns might have changed, movement data, how people's movement might have changed. Some of which may come from private sector data, like mobile phone data. Spend data may come from banks or the credit card companies or those kinds of things. So in short, I don't have exactly the answer right now. In a few months we will, but I think it will be a mixture of private and public sector, and I think the challenge will be to understand what are the incentives or what are the mechanisms by which, and what is the granularity by which those things might be shared, and for what purpose. So I'll finish there.
Right.
Sorry not to answer the question comprehensively.
Interesting, insight into that. So, Anne, I think we're going to run the second poll. If you can get the second poll up and running. The second poll. There we go. Thank you. Right. So this one is: what could the potential blockers to a green economic recovery from COVID-19 in your region? What could they be? So basically, what do we think? What do we think are the major impediments to this happening? Do we think it's lack of collaboration? Do we think it's lack of budget, so there's just no money? Do we think it's just lack of available data to make proper decisions? Do we think it's lack of awareness from the public? Or do we think it's something else? So I'm going to give everybody a second to jump in and do their bit, and then we'll talk about this. Be very interested to see what people's perceived ideas are in terms of why green economic recovery is tricky. We've still got people voting, so I'll give people another second or two.
Just one point, Nick.
Yeah, sure, go on, please.
For the vote to come through. And again, it kind of just picking up on some of the points that Gary made. The role of central government, national government, vis-a-vis the role of local government. I think for the average consumer, they don't necessarily differentiate. They're looking for a service, or they're looking for leadership. Right. I think certainly what's required, and I don't know if this, I'm not so close to it in Britain now, but I can see an emerging vision being generated. The green agenda, and also out the very important government putting whatever initiatives are appropriate in their local, the national vision. And I think that therein lies. So if that action is government and national government, well, actually, what winds up is the consumer and the population gets confused. So the national government should check the vision, ensure the resources are in place, and then roll it out to the local government and local authorities to implement whatever is implementable but aligned with the national vision.
Great, thank you for that. So we've got the poll results. So lack of collaboration was seen as the top. What I'm interested in is 9 out of the 22 who voted said something else. So I'd be interested from the crowd, anybody who voted something else, I'd be interested to know what it was beyond the collaboration, lack of budget data, or lack of awareness. I'd be really interested to know, because I thought that was pretty comprehensive. Didn't really expect to get a lot of some. Yeah, sorry,
Nick. For me, it was buying for the future.
Right.
If if people don't think there's a point to worrying about next week because this week's too hard already, that why would somebody say that they're prepared to pay more taxes, have a slightly more inconvenient life, so the world will be a little bit better for somebody else next week, if they're already struggling with this week?
Yeah.
And it's, for me, it's that we've got to make sure that everybody can see the benefit to it in tangible, real terms, not just some notional kind of over the hill, the skies will be bluer basis.
Yeah.
And that does mean we're going to have to pay for this stuff in a way that's more equitable, and not just allow people to feel better about it because they were able to afford it, and other people to feel worse about it, or worse still, ignore it as an immediate issue. So that will be, it's a bit hard for a Conservative to say, but a certain amount of redistribution of skin in the game.
Right. Yeah. No, I hear you. I see what you mean. Right, and I think we're going to run another poll. What's our next poll? I'm interested in hearing what everybody has to think about this stuff. Right. Right, here we go. So, what are the 3 key things that matter to economic recovery from COVID in your region? So this is a broad question that I'd be interested to know the answer to from the crowd. So leading role of local governments, urgent measures to reduce carbon emissions, collaboration from academia, governments, or collaboration across civil society and government, new investment, technological innovation, getting people back to work, support from national government, something else. But this is less about the green stuff in a sense. I mean, obviously it ties back, but it's really just about what are the 3 things that matter to economic recovery generally. How are we gonna recover from the crisis, the recession, depression, whatever we're in at the moment. Yeah, so I'll give you guys a little second to come in on that. Yeah. Right. So everybody's slowly trickling in. Yeah, I mean, beyond the green, what do we think about? I'll open this to the panel. What do we think about in terms of just economic recovery generally? What do we need to do? Does the government need to spend more money? Does it need to spend less? Does it need to do something really specific? I'd just be interested in your thoughts about just how we get out of the economic problem created by the crisis. Any thoughts from people on the panel?
You've got the economy moving.
Yeah.
I'm struggling to not go back into green because energy efficiency.
That's fine. I mean, I don't mind if you go back into green. It's just
energy efficiency retrofits demonstrated with lots of research to show the biggest number of jobs created per million spent. And so I think that's why they have been targeting the green recovery. You know, I think they're doing it for multiple reasons. The primary one is actually economic recovery.
Right.
So I think there is a double win there. But getting people back into work is surely the thing. Luckily for us, green recovery helps that.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. So we've got the poll results. I'd say the biggest ones are new investment and getting people back to work, which makes sense. You know, obviously you need to get people back to work. The point being is that I guess if you can do the sustainability stuff in terms of some of the stuff that we've discussed here today, then you sort of solve that problem. Right, and I think I'm going to run another poll. What's the next one? Here we are, green recovery poll. So what would be the first 3 priority sectors to target to accelerate the delivery of a net zero future in your region? So basically this is sort of like the overarching kind of, this is the overarching question that we've come to solve, which is, you know, what would you prioritize in terms of transport, in terms of energy? That can be pretty broad. Agricultural, we could say that's nature-based. Built environment, renewable energy technology, and again, something else if people have something else. Give everybody a second. Everybody's piling in. Thank you very much. This is kind of the big poll, really. Interesting that transport is zooming ahead. Right, so let's share the results. Here we are. So, yeah, transport was the big winner. I think, again, transport's a very large area because you could be talking about, do we need more electric vehicles? Do we need more? In fact, actually, that's a question I'm going to throw to the crowd. If we're talking about transport, and I know some people have come in on points in their 5 minutes, so I know some of this has been covered, but I'd just be interested in throwing it to the panel generally. If we were looking at transportation as being a major driver of, if we're looking at that as the sector, basically, to prioritize, let's put aside retrofitting. I know that's come up a lot as well, and that's a big one we obviously can't ignore. But if we're looking at transportation, is it electric vehicles? Is it, you know, basically, what is it? What is the transportation-based thing that we need to do to accelerate green growth, basically? Any thoughts from people?
I can come in on that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Max.
You know, as a layperson, really, you know, I'm not talking from an industry insider expert perspective, but I think we have to remain very clear that there's not a viable route forward in terms of rethinking and rewiring our transport system over the next 30 years that doesn't involve reducing the number of miles driven in cars. And I think that brings out, I don't know if it needs to be attention, because ultimately we need to invest in much better public transport infrastructure and greener roads, like I was suggesting earlier. But it could be perceived as attention with narratives that identify growth opportunities in EVs. If we assume that we're just simply going to replace every single internal combustion engine car we have in the country with an electric vehicle, and that's going to be really the kind of primary thrust of our strategy to decarbonize transport, then we're not going to meet our carbon targets. We just can't build that many EVs that quickly and roll them out. And it also wouldn't solve air pollution problems entirely either, because there are particulates released from brake pads and tires and all that kind of thing as well. So you know, that's really like that's the big overarching challenge. You know, 3/4 of people pre-COVID drove to work, which, you know, I live in London, and that's kind of a foreign idea to me, because, you know, it's 66% of journeys in London currently not made in cars, but that's reality actually for most people. That's how our transport system has been designed, and that's been embedded over half a century now of car-centric design. And we need to start rethinking that in a significant way. But as I picked up on earlier, that does actually hold out lots of opportunities for skills-heavy, capital-intensive, innovation-heavy work. And we can be intelligent about how we direct investment into our transport system that actually makes it fit for purpose for the 21st century and doesn't just do the same old things that we did in the 20th. So that's my big pitch. You know, let's get out of cars and get into high quality, high tech, smart public transport, and also innovate lots of different mobility services that serve rural communities better, that serve urban communities better, because with big data we can do that.
Right, I'm going to just pick out Ted for a moment. I've got a question about just staying on transport, so we cover it. Someone has put a comment saying public transport should be both invested in and made free to users, as in Luxembourg. Ted, what do you think? Do you agree, or if you disagree, what are your thoughts?
I think it's an interesting question. Actually, it's something that Max and I spoke about, I think, on Monday this week, and the work he's doing, they're going to be doing in this space sounds really interesting. But I mean, the question around free transport, like, I mean, obviously, who wouldn't love free transport? But like with anything, you know, the government they're in a situation where money is not, you know, over available. We need to look at how we're going to be able to decarbonize while also, you know, trying to keep costs down, especially post pandemic. So yeah, I think investment is definitely needed, and if there was the capability, free transport would be brilliant. But actually, what I think will have to be done is crowding in a private sector investment in order to invest in that green infrastructure, and this can be done by financing institutions like I've already mentioned, or guarantees. But there's various different mechanisms that can help crowd in that private finance. But I don't think it can all be pinned on the public purse.
Right. No, fair enough. Anyone else on the on Ted there? Thank you very much for that answer, Ted. That was great. Anyone else want to come in on the free transport? I'm just interested in it, in the panel's kind of thoughts on it. There's some people I can guess what they might think, but I don't want to make any presumptions. No.
I can go in. Oh, sorry, Gary. Go ahead.
Well, all I was going to say is it's a bit of a throwaway line. When we introduced free bus travel for pensioners, we encourage people to do more journeys, not less.
Right. Yeah.
So free isn't necessarily the route to the end of all evil.
Yeah. No, got you. Lane, you had something.
Yeah, I mean, a similar point. I think we need to examine if free is really the barrier to people actually using, is cost the barrier to people using public transport? And, there are many, it's one point of friction, but there may be many other points of friction. And cost is also used, as Gary points out, as a mechanism to regulate demand. So if you look at the tube in London, the tube's very expensive, but the tube is almost at capacity. So reducing fares would actually be counterproductive, because you might encourage more people on it, although it's not necessarily fair. And I think we need to differentiate between fairness and cost. But there are other ways of dealing with the fairness side of things through other free travel mechanisms. But I think you need to take a system-wide view where you look at, well, what is actually influencing demand? Where do we want people to go? Do we want to enable people to access jobs and employment opportunities and housing and so on? What's the purpose of the transport system? And then look whether cost is the barrier or enabler to that.
Right. Thank you.
Nick, if I could just chip in there, I think the concept of economic geography comes into play here through the work I've done with the UK 2070 Commission, if people have heard of that. It's a kind of levelling up initiative with the Metro mayors. The clear thing that comes out there is it's not fair if the economic geography, if you like, of people that can access central Manchester as a place of employment costs £25 a day, whereas in London it might be £10 a day. And so I think the cost item comes in that we need to allow people to get to work and be mobile from their dwelling to a place of employment. And I think the more we restrict that through cost, the better. But free might not be the answer. But the counterpoint I put in the messages is the investment, per person per mile is a huge disparity between the southeast and everywhere else in the UK, and is a natural priority number one for the levelling up agenda. How it manifests in all those that Leanne was talking about modal shift and public transport and getting it right, that's really complex. But we need to do it. We need to allow people to get to the places where wealth is being created, where there are jobs. I think that's the policy challenge. It's not an answer.
I guess the question around transport as well that none of us can answer, because it really comes down to how many people are going to work from home, what that balance is going to be, what is that going to do to places like London, where people obviously have to pay a premium. It's where the jobs are, everyone's, where everyone is. But actually, I think that's the fascinating unknown in all this, is actually how people are going to respond. Sorry.
There's the thing around taxes anyway, they're indirect taxes. So if you want people to be less humpy about not spending more money on roads, don't keep putting up road tax. Because if you call a tax road tax, people think they're paying it for the roads. So you'd probably be better off increasing, again, this is odd for a Conservative to say, something like income tax and scrapping road tax altogether.
Right.
That way you're breaking the link between the tax and the piece of infrastructure that it's allegedly attached to.
Yeah.
And you would probably also then shift resources more around. I mean, like I live in the middle of nowhere basically, and people who live in the places where I live have to have as an essential means to get from where they are to where they need to be, buy things to eat or to work or to get the kids to school. All of those things rely on some form of personal transport, and it's all too far to do on a push bike. So cars are an essential item. So the road tax that they pay is a disproportionately large amount of money out of their pocket, whereas if their low wages had a bit more income tax taken off of them, then, you know, at the end of the week or the end of the month, they would probably be either no worse or probably financially a little better off. And you would have broken the link between the taxation and the piece of infrastructure that you're telling people you don't want them to use.
Okay, so well, what about, let's just, well, I see your point, Gary, but what about something like something like what they have in France, like the péage, you know, where actually it's just the main, like, big motorways between cities.
But only tourists use péages, you know that.
Yeah, well, exactly. So is that not a good thing?
Well, some of the péages you're paying less than €1 to use.
They're actually pretty expensive, a lot of them, because some of them are pretty pricey. I mean, they're a big...
Yeah, I've toured all around France avoiding the péages. We did a couple of weeks holiday for a couple of years, trying to get around the whole country off of the péage and just drawing the map up about where the roads would have been. The amount of money I spent on diesel in my car over what I would have spent on paying to get on the actual péage, it's a non-runner. But the French people have a very distinct dislike about paying for them.
Right, yeah. So I see your point. You're basically saying, like, actually, the French avoid it. So in actual fact, in terms of emissions, people are actually just, they're doing more high intensity. Yeah, I think I get what you're saying. Do we have any more? Sorry, Max, come in.
I was just going to say, I don't know enough. I don't know really anything, to be honest. But I'm driven on them about the toll systems, but it's clearly the case. I mean, certainly Germany, France, Italy. I mean, most of the Western European countries do have a system of road tolls for the major trunk roads, and so in that sense we are a bit of an outlier. And I don't know enough about the full kind of gamut of charging and taxation across our transport system, but I think it does seem at first pass that we're better at basically protecting motorists from rises in taxes and charges for use of infrastructure than we are people using public transport. And for example, the train system, the bus system. In London, the vast majority of the money that actually runs the transport system is just purely based from the revenue it derives from ticket sales, which means that in the COVID crisis, they basically don't have any money now. And the government is being able to, I would argue quite cynically, impose some really quite onerous conditions on the extension of loans to them in order to see them through. So it's made the system very vulnerable at this particular point. But in general, I think it's a wider question of equity and also, I suppose, just policy prudence in terms of who is paying for what and how that relates to what ultimately we want to incentivize it and what we don't. Don't get me wrong, this is complicated. And the problem is that because we have car dependency for many people, simply just increasing the cost of driving doesn't mean they stop driving. It often just means they get poorer. And that's what we want to avoid. So we have to approach this in an intelligent way. But I think looking 50 years ahead, we should surely be wanting to move towards a system whereby actually we are taxing efficiently across things that we want to disincentivize and manage demand for, and using the revenue from that to invest in and incentivize the things that we do want people to be doing. And I don't think our transport system currently does that.
Right, thank you, Max. Right, so we're running short on time. We've only got less than 5 minutes, 4 minutes left. So it's at this point that I'd just like to ask if any of the panelists have something that they would like to say that they haven't had a chance to say, or, I mean, I think we've been pretty comprehensive in covering all the bases, but it would be interesting to see if anybody has any final concluding thoughts or anything like that.
Just a very quick one from me, only one liner. Given that we are just about to hit another massive recession, the country only ever gets out of recession by building its way out. So probably the single biggest focus, if you was just going to pick one out of everything, it will be construction. And not just saying construction, but preparing to use construction to build out of recession. Normally we prepare after we start to adopt the policy, so we're importing most of the materials we use. If we're going to do it this time, let's start making the products that will reduce the carbon footprint of the country now, so that when we do decide to build our way out, the products are here and not being imported.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Gary. Anyone else? Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think finally, my final point would be, from listening to the very interesting discussion and knowing a lot of the communities that a lot of you folk are referring to, I think we have to look at this in the context of, you know, a 20, 30, 40-year vision about more sustainable communities, about having our towns and villages rebuilt and repopulated and repopulated with families, and making it easy for those families to work there and to live there and to be supplied there, and having a proper transport infrastructure to get them from A to B. And as long as it's more competitive public transport than getting into a private car, whether it be an electric vehicle or an internal combustion vehicle, then that's what people will do. But we have to look at this in the overall vision of sustainable communities going forward, and winning back the centres of some of the most beautiful towns in Britain, historic towns up and down that have been ravaged by out-of-town shopping centres and people moving off into one-off housing locations and so forth. So I think this is a great opportunity to get back into a more sustainable vision about how we as society live within our communities.
I think just backing that up, I'd say as a final point on myself, I agree with the sort of the term vision thing. I think that if we're going to think about this properly, there needs to be, some more macro planning as opposed to short-termism. But on that, I shall leave it there. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining. Thank you very much to our 6 panelists for all their thoughts. And thank you for everybody who participated, particularly everyone who voted in the polls. That's very interesting for us, information for us to have. And thank you for all turning out today and helping Project Cygnus on its way forward. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.